All right. Happy Archaeology Wednesday, I guess. We should be live on Facebook and YouTube. We're just going to take a couple of seconds and verify that to make sure everything is working properly. So we should be streaming from the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page, which it does look like we are currently doing that. And we should also be streaming from the Moundville Archaeological Park and Museum Facebook page, which it does looks like it's working properly. I'm going to go over to the UA Museum's YouTube channel, which, if you don't know, UA Museums does have a YouTube channel. So if you do prefer to watch on YouTube, you can do that if you go to youtube.com/UA Museums. I'll actually pop one of those guys up there, and so that'll help you watch on YouTube if you prefer to watch with us that way. All right, Matt. So we are live and everything is working as it should, which is always nice to see. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I am the communication specialist for UA Museums. And joining me for a discussion about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail is Matt Gage, the director of the Office of Archaeological Research. Well, good morning, Matt. It's good to hop on to the trail with you once again and see what we have to learn about the Mound Trail.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me here in OAR's research library. We love this place, and it's a fantastic spot to be able to do these live streams from. So I'm happy to be here today, Rebecca.
Well,
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I'm excited to hop back on the Mound Trail. And before we do that, so we're going to be broadcasting here on Facebook and YouTube. Feel free to ask us any questions in the comments if you do have some questions for Matt about the Mound Trail. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen. So hang in there in case Facebook has any issues, YouTube has any issues, or we have any issues. Hopefully that won't happen, but since this is live, anything is possible. So I guess now that we've gotten that business out of the way, Matt, where do you want to get started?
All right. So first off, I want to say that I'm so impressed that you managed to get us a YouTube channel. That is fantastic.
Yeah, we're
all the places that have YouTube channels, and for the University of Alabama Museums to have one is great.
Yeah, no, we're cranking a lot of content out. I'm really proud of all the creative stuff that everybody's been doing from UA Museum. So if you want to make sure that you never miss any of the content, any of the live streams, or any of the Moundville Mondays, or any of the isolation observations, or any of the creative stuff we're doing, you can go to youtube.com/UA Museums, and you'll never miss a video.
Great. Well, we're going to get back on the Mound Trail. We've already covered quite a few of the mounds so far. We started with the Florence Mound. We moved on down to the Gulf Coast at Gulf State Park. Then we went to Indian Shell Mound Park and back up into the middle of the state to Moundville Archaeological Park, then up to Oakville Indian Mounds, then to the Bessemer site, then back down to the coast to Bottle Creek, over to East Alabama to the Choccolocco Creek Archaeological Complex, and then we ended last week with the Coker Ford site. So that means we've still got 4 sites to discuss right now, and they're the Fuller site, the Hamilton Mound site, the mound at Fort Toulouse, also known as Fort Jackson, and the mound at Old Cahaba Archaeological Park. So if it's all right, we're going to jump in with the Fuller site. So the Fuller site was kind of an unusual selection for us. It's not a massive mound. It's not one that when you're driving along and you see this incredible mound popping up out of the vista, you say, holy cow, that is an amazing earthen mound or shell mound or stone mound. It's sort of a low midden mound, and that mound is formed primarily from shell. Now we have several shell mounds that we've already talked about, like down at Gulf State Park and over at on Dauphin Island at Indian Shell Mound Park. But this one is a little different. We know this one started to be occupied during the late Archaic, and it's a really interesting site. It's situated up on a promontory, kind of overlooking Mobile Bay. It's not too far upriver from Spanish Fort, and it's really kind of a neat site. It was excavated partially by an archaeologist named Reed Stowe. And Reed had gone out and taken a look at this site as part of development that was going to be going in on the property. And the folks in that development wanted to make sure that they protected this site. So they did. They preserved the spot, and then the Archaeological Conservancy got involved, and they acquired the property. So right now, it's protected by the Archaeological Conservancy. And the site itself, again, it's sort of a low shell mound. It's not super prominent, but there's a cul-de-sac right there, and you can drive out and you can see this mound. And I think the sign is supposed to be installed shortly, and it's really a neat spot. But the site wasn't just occupied during a brief period of time, starting in the late Archaic. It was actually occupied for quite a while, all the way up into the woodland. We know that because of some of the artifacts that Reed recovered when he did his excavations out there. It's not just a prehistoric site either. There was actually an African-American earthwork that was built there by the Union Forces, African-American Union Forces. And it occurred late in the Civil War when the Union Forces had taken over the eastern bank and had started to set up earthworks at both Blakely and up here on top of this promontory. And if you go to the site, you can actually still see some of the rifle trenches that were put in that area. So it has a very long history and an incredibly varied history. It's a pretty interesting spot. So we recommend that if you live down in that area, you take a ride by and take a look at this site. It's pretty amazing. And the Archaeological Conservancy does a fantastic job of helping to protect a lot of these sites. They work with local communities and municipalities and private landowners that own property that contains really significant archaeological sites. And in a lot of instances, they'll either advise them on how to proceed with protecting the property, or they will purchase the property themselves and help to protect it for the long term. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah, Matt, I have a question. So it seems like a lot of these mound sites are near bodies of water. Is that pretty typical?
Absolutely. We talked about Bottle Creek and how that site is kind of in the middle of a swamp. And, we wouldn't today think that was a very hospitable environment. But if you were living in years past and the primary mode of transportation for heavy items was water travel, these spots that are situated right along these major waterways are perfect. And, just like now we have cities that were either developed along transportation routes like roads, or a lot of them are still along waterways where we have barge traffic going up and down the rivers, or along rail lines. It was the same thing back then. So places where you had easy access to the rivers, a lot of places where you had fords of the rivers, or a lot of places where you had confluences of rivers, were vital locations for Native Americans prior to European contact and prior to the development of the automobile and the train and other trail systems. So it's pretty neat.
Very smart.
All right. So on to the Hamilton Mounds. The Hamilton Mound site is one of my favorite sites. It's really an interesting spot. It's up in Marion County, Alabama, so northwestern part of the state. And to be honest with you, we still don't know a whole lot about the Hamilton Mounds. There isn't any record of major excavations into the mounds. We know that back in the 90s, there was some work done. They wanted to put in some trails and some picnic areas out there. And Paul Jackson and some of the folks from Pan American Consultants went out and did some work in that location. And they identified the mound as having primarily a Moundville 2, possibly a Moundville 3 construction association. So these folks were undoubtedly tied into Moundville. This site is about 20 miles north of the Tuscaloosa County line, or a little bit more than that, I guess, and up in Hamilton, Alabama. And there's quite a stretch to get down to Moundville. But again, if you get onto the Buttahatchee River, which is right there, and take it all the way down into the confluence with what does the Buttahatchee flow into? Is that the Tombigbee or is that into the Sipsey? I can't remember which. But then you can gradually work your way down the river system to get to Moundville. And on top of that, there were trail systems in place. In fact, when Europeans settled the area, they started to take advantage of some of those trail systems. And Andrew Jackson actually built a military road that runs right through this mound complex. And the main reason is because there's a perfect ford of the Buttahatchee River right there at the mounds. So, we were talking about water travel. You've got the Buttahatchee River flowing right past this. You had land travel with this older trail system that crossed right there at a ford of the river. And as a result, these people selected the location as a perfect place to build a mound site. So it's kind of a meshing of a whole bunch of different reasons for them to have selected this location, but it's a prime spot for this mound complex.
That's really interesting to hear about Andrew Jackson. Some of that history, that historical context, helps me place where in time these people were and what they were doing during that time.
Well, again, if we go back and we start thinking about early European settlement of North America, they were the interlopers. They didn't know where resources were. They didn't know how to get from point A to point B. And instead, they took advantage of either friendly indigenous populations or the trail systems that indigenous populations had in place already. A lot of times, the first settlements were established in either abandoned settlements where indigenous populations had moved out of, in many instances, to avoid those European interlopers. Or they settled with the Native Americans themselves and lived with them for many years, in some instances, centuries. When we start talking about the mounds at Fort Toulouse, for instance, we'll get into a little bit more of that. But, Europeans took complete advantage of some of the amazing engineering that had been conducted by indigenous populations long before they arrived. These trail systems that connected, far distant communities, the waterways and the transportation systems that included like the canals down along the Gulf Coast would have been perfectly viable for European settlers to jump right in and take advantage of. And it's pretty common.
Yeah. I have one more question about the Hamilton Mound site. So you mentioned that there's still a lot that we don't know about it. What could we do to learn more about it?
Well, we know very little because there has been very little archaeological exploration of the mound site itself. To date, there have been a series of shovel tests excavated around the base of each of the mounds. And then there were some shovel tests that were excavated in association with some signage that was put up out there. And that's about it. So we really don't know, for instance, how many stages of construction were involved in the building of the Hamilton Mounds. We don't know if there may have been a woodland foundation to those mounds, which we've talked about many times during our discussion of the Mound Trail. Mississippians, just like everybody else, took advantage of what was there on the landscape, and a lot of times Mississippian folks would take advantage of woodland mounds that had been started 1,000 years prior to their arrival in the area, and would build on top of it. And we've seen that at Oakville. We've seen that at many places.
And a shovel test, is that what it sounds like? Do you dig in with a shovel to look at the ground or the earth?
So when you watch TV and you see archaeological excavations, typically they're working in what are called test units. And test units are square units that are measured off so that you can keep track of exactly where every artifact and feature comes from within that unit. Shovel tests are a little different. They're the initial testing that we do, where we go out to an archaeological site and we actually dig a hole with a shovel and we screen the material that comes out. And typically what we try to do is be very careful to keep track of how deep the materials are coming out And then once we're done digging the hole, we look at the stratigraphy and we examine the soil profile in that shovel test and try to determine if there are intact cultural deposits in the profile of the shovel test. And those tests are very handy, not only for providing the artifacts, but for giving us a better understanding of how the site was formed.
That is very cool. I learned a new test that I didn't know in terms of archaeology. So thank you for answering my question.
Absolutely. Now, shovel tests are the least controlled excavation method that archaeologists use. So, in a lot of instances, you can be doing more damage than you intend by digging a shovel test. A test unit is far more controlled. Usually, when we excavate a shovel test, we're doing it relatively rapidly. But when we dig a test unit, usually we're far more controlled. We're going slower, and we're making sure that we're maintaining the deposits within the archaeological stratigraphy that occurs at a site. And that helps us to be able to interpret how old things are, where they come from, and again, the formation of the site itself. If you think about your yard, for instance, okay, if you go out into your yard and when you're, say, 6 years old, you drop a penny on the ground. A few years go by, leaves fall from the trees, they kind of build up on the ground, and gradually that penny will become buried a little bit deeper in the ground all the time. And we know that dust blows around all the time and dust will settle on top of it. And as the decades go by, that penny gets a little bit deeper all the time. And by the time that you get to, 100, 200, 400, 1,000 years, that penny is going to be buried in the location that may have some interesting stratigraphy associated with it. So you'll have those naturally deposited layers above it where, say, the leaves fell and rotted and formed soil. And then on top of that, you may have a flood deposit that happens someday when, the river near your house gets up really, really high and deposits some sand or alluvium on top of it. And then say, somebody comes in and builds a house next door and they push some dirt over the top of it. Again, gradually that penny gets buried deeper, but the story of that penny and the development of the property is told in that stratigraphy. And you can look at all those different layers and tell a whole lot about how a site's formed. And that's one of the main things that we look at in archaeology. So back to the Hamilton Mounds, we've never had these nice test unit excavations conducted at the Hamilton Mound. So again, we don't know a whole lot about it other than the work that was done there around the base, where we know they collected certain artifacts that show us that the mounds primarily date to around Moundville 2 to Moundville 3. So somewhere right around, we talk about the Hamilton Mounds as being occupied from about 1250 to 1500. More likely, it's a little bit later than that. Probably 1300 or so. So again, it's really, really neat spot. There's a massive floodplain for the Buttahatchee River that flows through that area, and it's a very archaeologically rich place. And if anybody has a chance to take a canoe trip or kayak trip or even an inner tube trip down the Buttahatchee River, it's a beautiful place to go. So, all right. Let's move on to the mound at Fort Toulouse and Fort Jackson Park. This is another really interesting spot. And again, here we are talking about the confluence of rivers and the occupation of a place that would have been very influential for anybody trying to get up either the Tallapoosa or the Coosa River. And it's right there at the confluence of the two at the head of the Alabama River. And the location is so important. Realtors always talk about location, location, location. Well, that's definitely the case with this site. It's situated right there at the confluence of these two rivers, right at the head of the Alabama River. And it would have been a vital, vital location for trying to control commerce up and down the Tallapoosa and the Coosa. So we know that the folks that settled this area were Muskogean. We know that primarily. Later, we know that they were part of what became the Creek Nation. We know that because these folks had a lot to do with the early explorers in that area. Again, we're talking about a location that was vital not only to the indigenous populations that were there, but also to the Europeans who started to settle the area. In fact, the French were so concerned about this location that they set up a fort here, Fort Toulouse. And the fort was the easternmost fort of the Louisiana Territory. Some folks may not know that Alabama and Mississippi were part of the Louisiana Territory, and then Alabama was part of the Mississippi Territory. But the French had the Louisiana Territory, and they were very worried about the British and the Spanish. The British were further over to the east in the area of what's now South Carolina and Georgia, and they very much wanted to move west into this area. And the same with the Spanish. The Spanish and the British and the French had gone back and forth about who controlled Alabama. And when the French set up this fort, it was intended to be an outpost that would help to protect the French interests in that area. And they set it up at a location that was already occupied by the Alabamas. And the Alabama developed into one of the groups in the Creek Nation. And they, the French, settled with this group of Alabamas, and some of them even intermarried. Unlike the British and the Spanish, who tended to maintain social distance, for lack of a better term, from the populations that they were trading with, the French really intermingled more with the populations they settled with. So a lot of times you had French traders living with the indigenous communities. And in this instance, when they set up this fort, they set it up right adjacent to an Alabama village. They interacted directly with the tribes, and part of that was in an effort to reduce costs by the French government. They expected these guys to be able to forage for themselves, to establish themselves, to sustain themselves through relationships with the local communities. And they even promoted the idea that they take Indian wives and help out in the Indian communities. And that was very beneficial for the French at the time. Now, it so happened that that may not have been the best approach for being able to keep the native alliances, because the French didn't have the trade networks that they needed to be able to provide goods and implements that the native populations wanted. The British and the Spanish were both pretty adept at being able to establish trading posts and other things, and to work with the tribes to provide them with the implements that they wanted. And when you start looking at the deerskin trade that occurred in the 17 and 1800s, these British traders were just going everywhere, all over the Creek Nation, trying to get these people to provide them with deerskins, and they were trading iron implements and brass kettles and things that the indigenous population saw as being incredibly useful. If you're a native and you're accustomed to hunting with a bow and arrow, and all of a sudden somebody comes along with musket, you're going to recognize that that's a pretty handy tool and a pretty interesting implement. If you're accustomed to using a greenstone celt or a lithic adze to work wood, and all of a sudden somebody comes along with a hatchet or an axe, you're going to recognize that iron or steel implement is pretty handy, and you're going to consider trying to acquire one for yourself. And one of the easiest ways to do that was to get involved with the deer hide trade. And that's exactly what happened. A lot of people don't know that in the Southeast, white-tailed deer had become very scarce as a result of this deer hide trade. And once you get into the early 1900s in the Southeast, there's nothing like what we see today, where we have, hunters being so excited about the white-tailed deer, because they'd been hunted very extensively, and they were relatively rare. So in the early 1900s, there was a push to reintroduce the white-tailed deer into this region. In fact, if you go into the Okmulgee National Forest, there's a place called Deer Pens. And Deer Pens is a location where they brought in white-tailed deer from the Midwest and reintroduced them into Alabama. And there's a massive hog wire fence out there that's about 12 or 14 feet tall, and in areas you can still see it, and that dates to the 1930s. So it was this effort to reintroduce white-tailed deer into the Southeast that derived from the deer hide trade, which derived from the British, Spanish, and French trading with the native populations here in the Southeast.
I know it's sort of, basic, but I think it's really cool that even just the connection of the animals of the time to know that history helps me sort of connect to the people, to the Native American culture, to know that they were interested in those animals as well. So I think even that basic information of, oh, those animals existed at that time, I think that's a cool connection.
There's so many connections like that in all of North America, well, all the world, really. It is. When I was a kid, I would often be out in the woods and I would think, oh, I bet I'm in a place that nobody has ever been before. And undoubtedly, about 2 minutes later, I would come across something that was clearly an indication that somebody had either had a house there or they had built some feature or modified the landscape in some way. And it's the same here in Alabama. When you start getting out into the woods and you really start looking around, you realize that people have had an incredible influence on our environment. And when you are out in an area that you consider to likely be, an old growth forest, someplace that, nobody has ever timbered or nobody has ever been before, it is incredibly rare to find a place like that. It's a situation where most of the places that you're putting your feet, people have been before, and they've done things like built whiskey stills up in narrow little hollows that you would never think that anybody would have settled in, and they've terraced hillsides that you would think would be too steep for agriculture. But if you're an individual that's limited in the property that you have, the only place that you can sustain yourself by having an agricultural field is on that slope. You're going to do everything you can to terrace it or build it up in a way that's going to allow you to utilize that. And even before that, Native American populations were modifying the landscape so extensively. When you read through a lot of the early ethnographies, it talks about orchards that extended out from native villages for miles. And an orchard doesn't necessarily require, a tractor to go around and spray pesticides on. It doesn't necessarily need to be pruned every year. It can be something like a chestnut orchard. The American chestnut was very prolific in the Southeast, and it provided an incredible amount of sustenance to the people that lived here. And when the chestnut blight hit in the 1920s, it wiped out almost all of the American chestnut trees. And the tree itself is incredibly versatile. If you look at early structures in the New England colonies in Virginia, for instance, the majority of them have chestnut timbers and chestnut floors. So it wasn't just the nut meat that they were going after. But the native populations took full advantage of this. And one of the prime ways that they would do that is through prescribed burns and promoting certain types of trees and plants that they wanted to grow in an area. So we know, for instance, that white oak provides some, fantastic acorns that aren't as bitter as red oak, and typically are larger and easier to process. So a lot of times, white oak was promoted. Hickory nut is the same thing. They would promote the growth of hickory nuts. Mass forests like oak and hickory dominated this area. And undoubtedly, that's a naturally occurring environmental factor, but it's also influenced by those native populations that wanted to make sure that those mass-producing forests prospered so that they'd have a place to go gather nuts. So it's pretty amazing how much of an influence on our environment, not just Americans or early European settlers, or folks that we think of today had, but native populations as well. And I'm constantly pointing out how incredible the engineering was, how amazing the trade networks were, the politics that were involved. But these people knew their environment. They knew how to live very well in their environment. They knew how to manipulate their environment very well. And we really have to give them credit for all of the things that they did before Europeans arrived. And to be honest with you, Europeans kind of messed things up pretty good when they arrived. And those diseases that wiped out so much of those native populations, it's just amazing to consider that any of their culture could still survive. And, we talked about getting on some of the web pages for the tribes and, doing some research into who they are and where they come from. And I still suggest that everybody take an opportunity to go take a look at those and learn about these native populations, because they're incredible. So, have you got any questions about the mound at Fort Toulouse?
Let me see. I'm going to pull this back up so I can see if we have any questions so far. Let's see. Trying to look, it looks like everybody's saying hello in the comment section. Just as a reminder, if you do have any questions for Matt about any of the mounds that we're talking about, it looks like we have a hello from South Mississippi. So we've got South Mississippi and Bruton in here. And so, New Mexico as well. So welcome everyone from around the country. And we got Baltimore, Maryland. So it's good to see everybody in the comments here. So I don't see any questions as of yet, but if you do have any questions about any of these mound sites that we're looking at today, feel free to ask them in the comment section and we'll get them to Matt. All right. So let's...
Fort Toulouse and Fort Jackson are actually a park that's maintained by the Alabama Historical Commission. It's a fantastic place to go.
Yeah, so I think you should be able to see the website up here. Now.
There we go.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful park. It's an amazing place with a lot of history. They've got fantastic signage, and the Alabama Historical Commission puts in a lot of effort to interpreting that site. And it's great to get an opportunity to go and take a look at it. You learn a lot about not just the Europeans that settled there and why they settled there, but about the indigenous populations that were there as well. So I recommend taking full advantage of that one. It's a really, really neat spot.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go down there. I've heard a lot about Fort Toulouse, and I've never been. So that's on my list. I'm just going to have to make a big trek around the Mound Trail and then go to some of these other sites. I'll need to put that as a priority.
So we have the Native American Festival here at Moundville, but Fort Toulouse has Pioneer Days. And at Pioneer Days, they have a celebration of Native American cultures. They have a lot of living history going on at the site at that time, and it's really an incredible time to go. Personally, I like going when there aren't so many people there, and an opportunity to really spend time at the various locations, reading signs and looking at the fortifications that are out there, some of which are rebuilt, some of which are original. And then just getting a chance to walk around the property and really get a feel for what it must have been like for the folks that live there. So it's a great spot, and the Alabama Historical Commission does a great job out there. If you get a chance to go see Ovi or Ned or any of the guys that work out there, they're fantastic folks.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm putting it on my list. Pioneer Days.
All right, on to the mound at Old Cahaba. As many folks know, Old Cahaba was the first state capital of Alabama. So we had territorial capitals that preceded Old Cahaba, but Old Cahaba was the first capital when we became the state of Alabama in 1819. We just celebrated our bicentennial, and they had some really interesting events and get-togethers at Old Cahaba to celebrate. They did an excavation, actually, of the state house out there that we were lucky enough to be able to help them with. And it's really interesting. The structure is difficult to interpret, because it doesn't necessarily conform to what you would expect that building to have been like. It looks like it was more of a and it wasn't a nice rectangle. Let me put it that way. It had some offset walls and some other things that Eric Sipes, the assistant state archaeologist, has been out there with Will Lowe working with Linda Derry, the site director on that property, and they've done a really neat job excavating that site. So if you get a chance, go take a look at that. But right across the road from the old state capitol building was the location of the mound at Old Cahaba. And the mound was a large flat top mound. It had a moat that surrounded it with a palisade wall that went up between the moat and the mound, and it would have been very well protected. It's situated right at the confluence of the Alabama River and the Cahaba River. So again, here we are at a location along two major rivers in Alabama. One of the really interesting things about the site is that it's a Pensacola phase site. So it's associated primarily with the Gulf Coast. And it's the northernmost expression of the Pensacola phase. And most likely it was a trading post, someplace that they, being the Pensacola people, had established on kind of the margins of the area that they controlled. But they were tied in directly with Moundville as well. They were trading items with Moundville and interacting directly with them. We see a lot of artifacts that come from Moundville appearing at this site. Now, the mound was instrumental in Governor Bibb's decision to build the Capitol at Old Cahaba. He thought that this was the perfect location to build the new State House on top of the mound. And he had visions of this being a large, beautiful brick structure that would have been built on this elevated surface above the confluence of these two rivers. And that would have been very interesting, but it didn't happen that way. So he saw it as sort of being the progress of the American spirit and taking over this property from the, quote, savages, and that they were the dominant people that controlled this land, and they were going to build this capital on top of this mound to show that they had conquered the wilderness and the people that had come before them and were now in charge of all of the lands of Alabama. Well, the funding wasn't there for them to build this structure. So instead, they built what was supposed to be kind of a temporary building adjacent to it. And about this time, Bibb had a riding accident, smashed his head, and never recovered and died. And Old Cahaba didn't stay the capital for very long. If anybody has been down to Old Cahaba during the spring rains, you know that it tends to get a little damp down there where those two rivers come together. This is not on a high bluff. This is a place that if there is a major flood along the Alabama River and the Cahaba River, it has a tendency to get up into parts of the park and make it a little damp. And that didn't necessarily dissuade the development of Cahaba. It became a very prominent city, but it was also very susceptible to things like yellow fever and possibly malaria and other diseases that are related to environments that tend to get flooded and are a little on the swampy side. So if you think about the early Europeans that tried to settle there, they didn't fare too well. But if you think about the Pensacola phase culture that had kind of their heart in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta and the area around the mouth of the Chattahoochee River, these people were very accustomed to an environment that was subject to frequent flooding. They were very familiar with an environment that had a dense population of mosquitoes in the summertime and was accustomed to being pretty swampy. So this would have been a perfect location for them. And again, being right there at the confluence of these rivers, it was a prime location for them. Now, the mound at Old Cahaba is no longer standing. In the 1850s, when the railroad came through the area, they took advantage of this nice pile of dirt and they stole it and they used it to build the railroad grade. So when you go out there today, there's just a leveled area where this mound once stood. And over to one side of it, just to the south of where this mound would have been, um, you can see the foundation of what was a cotton warehouse. And that was actually used as a prisoner of war facility during the Civil War. It was renamed Castle Morgan after a Confederate soldier that had been captured and held in a Confederate soldier named Morgan, who had been held in Ohio and managed to escape from that prison and return south. So the Confederacy ironically named this facility Castle Morgan in honor of his escape from Union clutches. But this prisoner of war facility was, probably a difficult place to live. And at the end of the Civil War, the prisoners were loaded up and sent downriver, where they were put on the Sultana. And the Sultana was a steamship that was then supposed to deliver them up the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, the Sultana exploded. And when it exploded, over 2,000 people died on board. So I can't imagine having survived being a prisoner of war at Castle Morgan. The war finally ends. You load up on this steamship to go home, and unfortunately it blows up, and you and the majority of your former prisoner friends are either burned to death or drowned as a result of it. So it kind of has a sad history to it. But if you go back in time again to when the mound was there, I had mentioned earlier that there had been a palisade wall around it. And we've talked about palisades before. They're protective walls that are found at a lot of these Mississippian sites and even back into the woodlands. So a high fence. Some of them would have been cut in wattle and daub. But this one had a big moat outside of the fence of the palisade. And if you go down to Old Cahaba today, you can still see remnants of that moat. And that moat was very important to the interpretation of the archaeological site that's there, primarily because the mound was long gone. It was gone in the 1850s, and it wasn't until more recently that archaeological investigations were conducted there, and test units were placed into the moat itself with the idea that the materials at the bottom of the moat would help to give a pretty good indication of the age of the occupation there. And that's where the majority of the Pensacola phase materials were recovered. So it's pretty interesting spot. Now, Old Cahaba itself is a park that's also maintained by the Alabama Historical Commission, and it's a beautiful place. It still has a lot of the historic remains that are there. There's the Crocheron columns. There's a whole lot of foundation remains. There's several extant structures that are still standing out there. And they've got a visitor center that's really neat. And if you get a chance to go down and meet with Linda Derry, the park director, or Jonathan Matthews, who's her assistant down there, they're fantastic people that will gladly show you around the park and show you not only the historic aspect of Old Cahaba, but the indigenous aspect of Old Cahaba too. That's just amazing.
Yeah, there's
by all means, take the opportunity, go down there.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of Alabama history down there at Old Cahaba. So we do have a couple of questions, Matt. So Timothy asks something about who originally owned the property that the mounds are located in Hale County. How and when did the state acquire this land? Do we know anything about that?
In Hale County? Is that what he said?
Yes, Hale County, yeah.
Okay, so Moundville is split right down the middle between Tuscaloosa and Hale County. And the property was divided between two plantations, the Prince Plantation and the Griffith Plantation. Moundville, the park, became the namesake of the town of Moundville. But Moundville itself, the town of Moundville, was originally named Carthage. And Carthage was an agricultural community, started in the 1820s. And then a rail line was built through Carthage, and it became a pretty important agricultural stop where cotton and corn and other crops were shipped out from the area of northern Hale County and southern Tuscaloosa County. But what became the park was originally part of two plantations. There are some remnants of those plantations around here. In fact, there is an African American cemetery that's situated in part of the park that was related to one of those plantations. And it encroaches onto one of the mounds where we know we have a whole lot of Alabama River phase burials. And when they excavate in that area, they kind of have to be very careful. It's been years since anybody's worked in that area, but in the 1950s, David DeJarnett did a number of excavations out there. And that location was considered when the park was originally developed in the 1930s and segregation was in full swing. And that area became the African American picnic pavilion. And they built a pond right there that was considered the African American swimming pond. So we know that that part of the Griffith plantation is set right over the top of what had been Mound U. Mound U is a really low mound. It's actually where the Duck Bowl was found here at Moundville by Clarence B. Moore. So the plantations were here. The property was acquired by the University of Alabama and the state of Alabama early on in the 1930s. Walter B. Jones at the time was the state geologist, and he was in charge of the Alabama Museum of Natural History. And Walter B. Knew that the park needed to be preserved, that these mounds were just an absolutely incredible thing. They had been cultivated for years. The summit of a lot of the larger mounds were kind of dished out from plowing. What they would do is go up on top of the mounds with a mule and a plow. And as you plowed your rows where you turned, the soil would kind of build up. So if you think about going along and plowing around, eventually you build up a little rim on the outside edges of the mound. So Walter B. knew that there needed to be some restoration of these mounds and protection. So he worked very hard to acquire the property. I think right now the park encompasses about 326 acres. Worked very hard to acquire the property. In fact, the last piece of the property, he mortgaged his own house to be able to acquire, with the intent that the university would eventually be able to afford to buy it from him. And that did work out for him, luckily. But the university has owned the property since the 1930s and has maintained it as a park since then. It could never have been developed as a park without the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC came in, had a camp here at Moundville, and built all the infrastructure for the park, did some restoration of the mounds here at the park, built the museum here at the park, built probably now about half of the structures that are still standing at the park. And some of that architecture is really, really interesting. If you just look at the architecture of the administration building here at as you come into the park, or at the museum itself, it's amazing how they designed and built these buildings. The museum is one of my favorite architectural features in the state of Alabama. It was built at a time when air conditioning didn't exist, and they had built an airflow system in the museum that allowed the air to be exchanged every 40 seconds or something amazing like that. So it basically created for a very strong airflow moving through the museum even before they had air conditioning. So pretty interesting. But that's a long-winded answer to a short question. So I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. That's a lot of good information. So Thad here says, I live in Wetumpka and have been to Fort Toulouse many times. Pioneer Days is a good historical event to go to. I'm definitely going to have to put that on my priority to-do list. So that's good to hear a recommendation from Wetumpka. Timothy also has a question. Do you have any information on mounds in, I don't know if I can pronounce that, Ecola or Ecola?
Echola, Alabama?
Echola. Okay. That's a new one for me. I grew up in Alabama, but I've never heard of that location. So do you have any information on mounds in Echola? I heard there's some in and around the Sipsey River. Is that anything you know about?
We do, but I don't personally have that information in my brain. I'm sorry about that. I won't lie to you and fake it, but we do here at the lab, and we can look up some information for you on that if you'd like. But I'm sorry, I can't give you more information than that right now. Do you have? Well, if you have our webpage up,
Let's see. Let's see if I can throw it up there. Let's see. Hang on a second. I will dig that information up. So you want to point people to the Office of Archaeological Research website?
Yeah, send me an email, and I can help him out with his interest in the mounds around Echola.
Yeah, so I'll bring that up real quick so that people can visit the website if they wish. You can definitely look at oar.museums.ua.edu and find more information out about the Office of Archaeological Research. We also have a Facebook page, so you can check that out. You might be watching this stream from the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page, but definitely go visit the website to get in touch with OAR if you have any questions.
Yes, please. So we had quite a tour of the Alabama Mound Trail. We've looked at all of the mounds around the state that are part of the trail right now, but we're not done with the trail. We want to expand it. We've been working with several folks on incorporating some new mound locations. Again, our primary concern is finding locations that are very interesting, important to the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail, but also that are protected. So we want to ensure that as we go forward and add more sites to this, that we are either promoting the preservation of these sites or helping the communities that have these sites to protect them. And please, if you live in an area where you know of some Indian mounds, keep an eye on them. Make sure that they're protected and they're safe. These are non-renewable resources. We'll never be able to build another mound like these that retain all of the information that these do. And just like, when we go in to do an archaeological excavation, these things are so sensitive. We have to be incredibly careful about how we excavate them. And there are a lot of folks that just want to go see what's in them, and they go start digging, and that ends up destroying so much of the information, and it really removes the opportunity to learn about this incredible heritage. And it's really a blow to our ability to understand our past. So please protect these sites as well as you can.
Yeah, and if you want more information about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail, you can go to alabamamoundtrail.org. It's a good, a short and sweet website URL. It's easy to remember, alabamamoundtrail.org, to find out more information about the Mound Trail. You can also find the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail on Facebook at Mound Trail. Also an easy one to remember there. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding those. But yeah, the Mound Trail is really important, very cool, and definitely worth looking into. Let's see if we have any last questions here. This is a good one. So how can people get involved in assisting the efforts with the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail? Is there are there volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead and contact us. There's some information available on the Mound Trail. Plus, you can just come to our webpage or the University of Alabama Center for Economic Development. We're partnered with the UA Center for Economic Development, and Brian Rushing and Candace Johnson have been fantastic partners helping us through all of this. And through either tourism or economic development or us, or even the Alabama Historical Commission, you can learn about ways to help protect these sites. And please, by all means, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, that is awesome. Well, I think that's going to wrap our trip up on the Mound Trail. Is that correct? We hit everything on the Mound Trail?
Absolutely. Thank you guys for going with me. It's been an entertaining trail. I wish that we could have done each one of these from the various locations. They're all amazing.
Well, that's still possible in the future. We will try to go and visit those mounds and those sites physically when we get a chance. But I think that's going to wrap it up for us, Matt. So I think that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. We'll be doing this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. And each day will feature a different aspect of UA Museum. So tomorrow we're going to be heading over to the Alabama Museum of Natural History's Facebook page. So if you want to, I think we're maybe doing some lizard snakes. So if you have any interest in those, we're going to be hanging out with Dr. Friel, the director of the Alabama Museum of Natural History. So come and visit with us tomorrow at 10 a.m. And for a full live stream schedule, we've got information that you can check out at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That's going to be your one-stop shop website for all of our live stream schedules, our educational resources that we've got there from Discovering Alabama, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, Discovering Alabama. We even have a coloring book. So if you have some little ones who like to color, or if you're an adult that needs a stress relief, you can download our coloring book there and visit for that information. If you're enjoying what we're doing here and you want to support UA Museums, you can go to give.ua.edu/museums and you can become a supporting member. And I guess I just want to thank everybody for visiting with us live and asking your great questions. And for anybody who's going to watch this later, thanks for hanging out with us and visiting UA Museums from your home. All right. Well, hope everybody has a great day. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.